So Homer Simpson. The thing I keep coming back to, the reason I wanted to do this video in the first place, is that Homer Simpson has been on television longer than most of the people watching this have been alive. That's not a stat I'm trying to make sound impressive. It's just a fact I find a bit disorientating when I let myself sit with it. The character first walked out of a cartoonist's notebook in 1987, shuffled onto the Tracy Ullman Show as a scratchy little interstitial, and then got his own series at the tail end of the 80s, and he's been there ever since. Same voice, same bald head, same pair of blue trousers, bigger belly maybe, depending on what era you're looking at, but essentially the same bloke. I remember the first time I realized I didn't actually understand Homer Simpson. I was watching a rerun late at night, one of those ones you've seen about 11 times, and it hit me that I couldn't actually explain him. Like, if someone stopped me in the street and said, "Describe Homer Simpson, go." I'd say something like, "He's a bit thick, he loves donuts, he works at a nuclear plant." But that's a description of a logo. That's not a person. And the show, when it wants to, absolutely writes him like a person. That gap between how easy he is to caricature and how strangely complicated he becomes when you actually pay attention, that gap is where all the fan theories live. And there are a lot of them, which I suppose is where we come in. I'm going to walk through over the next couple of hours all the Homer Simpson theories I think are actually worth sitting with. There's the coma one, which you've probably heard, where he's been unconscious since the early 90s and everything since is just his dream. There's the crayon thing, which is canon, sort of. There's the radiation theory, which I actually find more convincing the more I think about it. There's the one about his mother, which is genuinely quite sad. And then there's a handful of weirder ones that only really make sense at about 2 in the morning when you're half asleep and the telly's still on. Which, fair enough, may well be where some of you are right now. If you're into this kind of thing, long, rambly Simpsons tangents, the sort of video where I don't shut up for a couple of hours about a cartoon man, subscribing to the channel is free, and it helps more than you'd think. No pressure, no hard sell, just mentioning it now so I don't have to mention it later. A few things I want to say up front so we're on the same page. None of this is canon, or rather bits of it are canon and bits of it contradict other bits of canon. And the show itself has been happily contradicting itself for over 3 decades, because that's how you keep a show running that long. Continuity is a suggestion. Writers come and go, showrunners come and go, voice actors, mercifully, mostly stay. But the character of Homer Simpson has been written by, at this point, hundreds of different people, and each of them has had a slightly different idea of who he is, which is why he sometimes reads like a loving, clueless dad, and sometimes reads like a man who's quietly hollow inside. Both are him, both are accurate. The show has been holding those two readings in tension since about 1991 and hasn't resolved them because it can't. What I find interesting is that the fan theories are, in almost every case, attempts to resolve that tension. People want Homer to make sense. They want a unifying explanation for why he is the way he is, why he doesn't age, why he can survive anything, why the town around him behaves the way it does, why his kids are the way they are, why his marriage somehow keeps working when it logically shouldn't. And every theory we're going to walk through is someone's attempt to answer one of those questions. Most of them are probably wrong. That's honestly part of the charm of this. I don't think any of the theories I'm going to describe are what the writers actually intended. The writers were, in most cases, just trying to get an episode done by Tuesday. But fiction doesn't really belong to the people who make it, not after a while. Once something has been on for this long, the theories become the fiction. They're part of what the show is now. I should also mention, because it'll come up a lot, that I quite like Homer. I know that's a slightly odd thing to declare at the start of a video, but some of what we're going to talk about is not flattering to him. Some of it's a bit dark, and I don't want anyone getting the wrong idea. I'm not here to trash the character or the show. I'm here because I love this thing and I've thought about it too much, which is basically the baseline qualification for making a 2-hour essay about a cartoon character in the first place, right? That's the preamble done. Let's start with the one everyone knows, the one most Simpsons fans have either heard or had someone smugly explain to them at a party. The coma theory. which for all its faults is genuinely interesting once you actually unpack it because the person who originally came up with it wasn't being silly. They were trying to solve a real problem the show had created for itself. And the answer they arrived at is the kind of thing that, once you've heard it, sits quietly in the back of your head for the rest of your life every time you watch a new episode. So let's get into it. Right, so the coma theory. The claim, stripped down to its most basic form, is that Homer Simpson has been in a coma since 1993, specifically since a season 4 episode called So It's Come to This, which for reasons I'll get to in a moment is remembered as a clip show, but is also arguably the most significant episode in the entire run of the show if you buy this theory. The episode in question involves Bart pulling an April Fool's Day prank on Homer that goes badly wrong. He shakes up a beer can way too much, and when Homer opens it, it explodes. The explosion sends Homer flying across the room and eventually into a hospital bed where he ends up in a coma. The family sit around him, reminisce about old episodes, and eventually Bart confesses to causing the explosion. An enraged Homer wakes up, strangles his son, and the episode ends with Marge telling him he's been unconscious for weeks and has lost about 5% of his brain. That's what we see. That's the cover story. The theory says he never actually woke up. Everything from that episode forward, so we're talking early season 4 to now, which is something like 30 years of television, is the coma dream. The strangling, Bart's confession, Marge's reassurances, the return to normal life, all of it is the dream telling itself it's fine. Homer's sedated brain, trying to make sense of what happened to it, has constructed an elaborate, ongoing imaginary life where his family is around him and everything more or less works. And the reason the dream has been running for 3 decades of real time is that Homer, on some level, doesn't want to wake up. Or can't, or never will. I want to say, before I go any further with this, that this is one of those theories that sounds profound the first time you hear it, and slightly less profound the more you poke at it. But the reason it endures, the reason people are still writing threads about it on Reddit in 2026, is that it's genuinely doing some useful work. It's trying to answer a real question. That question is, why does The Simpsons, after season 4, feel so different from The Simpsons before season 4? And the answer the coma theory gives you is, because it's not the same show. It's a dream of the same show. The writers kept making episodes because the writers are real and they have jobs. But inside the fictional universe, what we're watching is Homer's unconscious brain trying to keep itself entertained. There's actually a decent amount of evidence fans will point to if you want to take this seriously. The show does undeniably get weirder after season 4. The plots get more surreal. Homer starts surviving injuries that should absolutely kill him. He falls into Springfield Gorge. He gets launched into space. He gets shot out of a cannon. He becomes friends with basically every living president and prime minister. He goes to every country in the world. He wins a Grammy. He becomes a boxer. He becomes an astronaut. He becomes an opera singer. He befriends Michael Jackson, sort of, depending on whether you count the episode that got pulled from circulation. None of this is remotely realistic, and it happens to him across a compressed timeline where he doesn't age. The coma theory says all of that is the dream getting thin. The unconscious mind can only generate plausible material for so long. Eventually, it runs out of realistic scenarios and starts reaching. The surreal later seasons are, in this reading, just the sound of Homer's brain starting to cough. I have a few problems with all this, though. The first and most obvious one is that the show was already getting weirder before. So it's come to this. Season 3 has plenty of its own surreal moments. Homer's dad turns out to have had a love child with a carnival floozy. Bart sells his soul. The family gets abducted by aliens in the Halloween episode. The show was always willing to go odd. It just got more willing as the writers got more confident. And the reason for that shift has a much more boring, non-coma explanation, which is that the writer's room kept hiring brilliant people. Conan O'Brien joined in '91. Other comedy writers came in. The whole place got funnier and more ambitious, and the tone drifted as a result. So the evidence that's usually offered for the coma theory, the evidence that the show gets weirder after season 4, is technically accurate but has a much less interesting explanation. The show gets weirder because comedy writers, given a long enough leash, will always drift toward weirder material. That's just how comedy writers work. The second problem is that so it's come to this is a clip show. Clip shows exist for one specific reason, which is that the writers needed to fill an episode slot without doing the work of writing a full new episode. The wraparound plot, the thing that holds the clips together, is almost always a bit slapdash because it's not meant to carry any weight. It's meant to get you from one clip to the next. The fact that this episode happens to have Homer in a coma as its framing device is, I suspect, a fairly mundane writer's room choice. They needed a reason for the family to sit in one place, reminiscing about old episodes, and a hospital bed is a good reason, which doesn't kill the theory exactly. You can argue that the theory works regardless of authorial intent. The clip show happens to have provided a useful hook that fans have latched onto. The dream is going whether the writers planned it or not. But there's something a bit poignant about the coma theory I don't want to dismiss, and it's the reason I think it's survived as long as it has. It's not really about whether Homer is literally in a coma. It's about the feeling, especially for longtime viewers, that the Homer of the current season is not the same man as the Homer of the early 90s. He looks the same, he sounds the same. His wife and kids haven't aged, his job hasn't changed, his house hasn't moved, but he is somehow a different person. The early Homer was a bit thick, sure, but he was also capable, loving, occasionally competent. The later Homer is, well, he's been through more. He's meaner sometimes, louder, more cartoonish, more of a type and less of a person. And if you're the kind of viewer who grew up with early Homer and can't quite square that version with the man you see on television now, the coma theory offers you a framework. Of course he's different. He's dreaming. The dream has been running for decades. Dreams change. The people in them change. The dream doesn't know it's a dream, and so neither does he. I think that's what keeps it alive. It's not really a theory about Homer. It's a theory about the passage of time, about what happens to a character when a show goes on longer than any show was ever meant to. You could apply the same theory to any long-running series, really. But because The Simpsons has been on longer than almost anything, and because Homer specifically is such a vessel for viewer projection, the theory sticks to him. One last thing before we move on. The floating timeline, the thing where Homer never ages and his kids stay the same age forever, works weirdly well as coma logic. Dreams don't obey linear time. A dream can loop. A dream can contain contradictions. A dream can decide that Homer met Marge in the 70s in one moment and the 90s in another, and the dreamer doesn't notice. Because the dreamer is also part of the dream. If you're looking for evidence that The Simpsons might be taking place inside someone's head, the fact that it's self-contradictory in its own canon is the best evidence you'll get. I'll come back to the floating timeline thing properly later. It's its own section, but it slots into the coma reading so naturally it'd be weird not to mention it now. Anyway, whether you buy it or not, the coma theory has been knocking around for a long time, and it's not going anywhere. It's the default Simpsons theory, in the way that it was all a dream, is the default theory for basically any show that goes on too long. People reach for it because it gives them a way to hold the whole long, strange run of the show in one frame. But there's another theory that tries to explain the same thing, the weird state of Homer's head, and it comes from the show itself rather than from fans. The show has offered its own explanation for why Homer is the way he is, and it involves genuinely an item from a child's pencil case. There's an episode in season 12 called Homar, that's the title, H-O-M-R, with no second E, which I'll explain in a second. The setup, and this is a genuinely strange episode even by Simpsons standards, is that Homer loses the family's savings by investing in a motion capture company. To get the money back, he signs up as a human medical test subject, which is the kind of thing you'd do if the rent was due and you'd run out of dignity. During the tests, the doctors take a 3D X-ray of his brain and notice something sticking out of his right lobe. They rotate the image a few times. It turns out to be a crayon. The crayon has, according to them, been lodged in Homer's brain since he was 6 years old. The way Homer explains it, he shoved an entire 16-pack of crayons up his nose as a kid. Eventually, he sneezed them out, counted them, thought he'd got them all. Apparently, he hadn't. One of them went the other direction. The doctors tell him the crayon might be the reason for what they delicately call his lifelong intellectual difficulties. Removing it could dramatically increase his intelligence or kill him. Homer, perhaps understandably, weighs up the risk and decides he'd quite like to be smart. He has the surgery. It works. His IQ shoots up from 55, which is where the show had been pegging him, to around 105, which is properly average. And for the rest of the episode, for about 10 minutes of screen time, we get to see what a smart Homer actually looks like. And this is where the episode gets genuinely interesting, and not in a way that's played for laughs. Smart Homer writes a report on the nuclear plant's safety. The plant gets shut down temporarily. All his colleagues get laid off. Moe bans him from the tavern. Lenny and Carl stop wanting to hang out with him. An effigy of him gets burned. The whole social fabric of his life, which was held together by him being the easiest, dumbest person in every room, falls apart. He tries to connect with Lisa, and for one brief, lovely stretch of the episode, they actually have a proper conversation. The kind of father and daughter who genuinely understood each other would have. And then he goes to her and asks why, if being smart is supposed to be so great, he's the most miserable he's ever been. Lisa tries to explain with a little graph that there's an inverse relationship between intelligence and happiness. The smarter you are, the more aware you are of things that ought to bother you. Smart Homer has become aware of everything he'd been protected from. The wasted years, the ways he'd fail people, the noise of the world. It's too much. So he has the crayon put back in. Moe, who as it turns out is also an unlicensed surgeon because of course he is, does the operation and calls it the old Crayola oblongata. Homer wakes up his usual self. His friends welcome him back. Moe lets him drink at the bar again, and the episode ends with Lisa, alone, finding a letter Homer wrote to her before the surgery was reversed, explaining that he now understood what it was like to be her and that he loved her more because of it. That last scene, for me, is one of the saddest things the show has ever done. Smart Homer knew going into the operation that his old self wouldn't remember any of it. So he wrote his daughter a letter he knew he'd never see again, knew he'd never follow up on, knew wouldn't change anything about how he'd treat her from the next morning onwards. He just wanted her to have the letter. He wanted her to know once that she'd been understood. No notes, absolute gut punch, that scene. Anyway, that's the crayon episode, and it's canon, which is a bit I keep having to remind myself of. The show has officially told us on screen in an episode that hasn't been retconned that Homer Simpson's lifelong stupidity is caused by a piece of colored wax in his brain. That's not speculation, that's just what happened, which is fine as far as it goes. But this is where the actual theory kicks in. The fan reading, the bit that goes beyond what the episode tells you, is about that letter. About the choice smart Homer made to have the crayon reinserted. The argument goes, Homer, when he's smart, doesn't just find the world overwhelming. He finds himself overwhelming. He looks at the life he's built, the marriage he almost ended, the son he's failed, the daughter he hasn't seen, the drinking, the job he's not competent at, and he can't stand being present for it. So he puts the crayon back. He chooses stupidity because stupidity is a way of not having to be accountable for any of it. And if you extend that reading, which plenty of fans do, Homer's stupidity starts to look less like a medical condition and more like a coping mechanism. The crayon is real, sure. But the reason Homer hasn't had it removed for good, the reason he doesn't take the risk, is that he's quietly worked out that dumb Homer gets to be happy and smart Homer doesn't. Given the choice between a life he can't look at clearly and a life he can look at clearly but wishes he couldn't, he picks the first one every time. This is what people mean when they talk about strategic stupidity. It's not that Homer is secretly a genius pretending to be thick, although you can find moments in the show that support that reading too. He invented Mr. Plow. He designed a car, admittedly a disastrous one. He wrote a passable screenplay. He figured out Mr. Burns' schemes more than once. The raw capacity is there. It's just that he's made peace with not using it because using it would mean seeing his life in a way that would break him. I find this reading genuinely compelling, but I also want to be a bit careful about it. It's the kind of theory that gives the character more intentional depth than I think the writers ever quite intended. HOMR works as an episode because it's a clever Flowers for Algernon riff, not because it was trying to set up a decades-long arc about the philosophical implications of willed idiocy. But it's doing something. The letter exists. The scene with Lisa is real. And the fact that the writers put that kind of emotional weight on a gag episode about a crayon suggests they knew, on some level, that Homer's stupidity is not just a joke. It's the condition of his life. It's what lets him keep living it. There's one more thing I want to mention about this theory, which is that it contradicts another bit of Simpsons canon, and that contradiction is its own small pleasure. In Season 9, a few years before HOMR aired, there's an episode called Lisa the Simpson, which we'll properly get to later. In that episode, the show establishes that Simpson men have a genetic defect that makes them go dumb as they get older. It's called the Simpson gene. It's on the Y chromosome. Lisa herself is safe because she's got 2 X chromosomes. Homer lines up all his male relatives, they're all failures, and the show officially tells us that Homer's stupidity is genetic. Then 3 years later, HOMR aired and said his stupidity is caused by a crayon. Both of these are canon. Both of them were written by people who presumably remembered the other one existed. And the show has never bothered to reconcile them because the show has never felt the need to reconcile itself with itself. Homer's stupid because of genetics and because of a crayon, and those things don't cancel each other out. They just sit next to each other like 2 competing theories in a badly organized folder, which is honestly sort of perfect. The show giving Homer 2 mutually exclusive explanations for his own brain is exactly the kind of thing that keeps fan theories alive. If there was one clean answer, there'd be nothing to argue about. Because there are 2, both canon, the fans get to pick which one they want to build on. Most of the crayon theory people quietly forget about the gene theory. Most of the gene theory people quietly forget about the crayon. And both groups are technically correct, which is the most Simpsons resolution imaginable. Anyway, that's the crayon. Whether you buy it as self-protective choice or just take it as a cartoon plot device about a man with waxy lobes, it tells you something about how the show has always thought about Homer. Not as a man who was born broken, but as a man who's made, at some level, a series of decisions to stay the way he is. Whether he could have chosen differently is a question the show never quite answers. It just keeps showing him making the same choice again and again in every episode. And since we're on the topic of things lodged in Homer's body that probably shouldn't be, let's talk about the nuclear plant. Picture the plant for a second. The cooling towers, the green glow, the endless beige corridors. Homer at his desk in Sector 7G with a button he presses when the red light comes on, which he has been pressing for longer than some of his colleagues have been alive there. There's a pond outside. Things live in the pond. One of them is a fish called Blinky, which has 3 eyes, and which the show introduced very early on to establish cheerfully that the water around the plant is absolutely not what you'd call drinkable. Blinky is supposed to be the joke. The whole town drinks that water, cooks with it, bathes their children in it, pours it into their tea if they drink tea, which I don't think Homer does, but you take the point. Here's the theory. Homer Simpson is a mutant, not in a superhero way, in a long, low-dose, chronic exposure way. His indestructibility, his memory problems, his cognitive decline, his inability to age, his weird metabolism, his capacity to shrug off injuries that would hospitalize or kill a normal person, all of it is the cumulative effect of spending his entire adult life in a poorly regulated nuclear facility. And Springfield in this reading is not a quirky, Midwestern town with an eccentric population. It's a contamination zone. The residents aren't odd because of personality, they're symptomatic. I'll be honest, this is the theory I keep coming back to as I've got older because it's the one that explains the most without requiring you to buy into any mystical dream state or coma logic. It doesn't need anyone to be unconscious. It just needs you to take seriously the fact that Homer works at a nuclear plant that has, across the run of the show, had multiple meltdowns, produced three-eyed fish, contaminated local rivers, got shut down for safety violations, and at no point has been depicted as a functional, well-run facility. If you put a real human into that job for 30 years, what you'd get is probably a man who looks a lot like Homer Simpson looks. Let me actually walk through the evidence, because once you start listing it, it stacks up. Blinky's the first obvious one. Blinky the three-eyed fish pulled from the water near the plant becomes a minor plot point when Mr. Burns tries to run for governor and has to publicly eat Blinky on air to prove the water's fine, and then promptly chokes on it, which is the show telling you in the plainest possible terms what it thinks of the plant's environmental record. That episode is early season 2, and everything the show has done with the plant since has treated Blinky as the baseline. The water's bad. The town knows. Nobody does anything. The second bit of evidence is the sheer number of times Homer should have died. He's been electrocuted so many times it's lost its dramatic weight. He's fallen into Springfield Gorge, bounced all the way down the cliff face, and survived both the fall and the ambulance accident immediately afterwards. He's been compressed to about half his normal height by a mishap with a nuclear press. He's been irradiated at point-blank range. He's eaten poisonous fish. He's been in space. He's been inside an industrial fire, an explosion, a runaway lorry, and on the receiving end of a cannonball, the boxing variety and the literal variety. And he shrugs them all off. Most of the time, we're meant to read this as cartoon physics, fair enough, but the theory says it's not. It says his cells have just got used to it. The DNA has been knocked around so many times that the normal rules of human fragility don't apply to him anymore. Then there's the obesity, the high blood pressure, the near heart attack episodes, the diabetes storylines, the fact that his body has been failing him on and off for the entire run of the show without ever quite giving up. His body does the thing a body does when it's been under chronic, low-grade, toxic stress for decades. It accumulates damage in ways that would be lethal quickly, and then, somehow, it keeps going. There are people in the real world whose bodies do this too. It's not romantic. It's what chronic exposure looks like. His memory, the way he forgets things from the episode before, the way Marge has to reintroduce him to basic concepts, the way he can't retain the names of his own children's friends, all of that's played as a gag. It's also exactly what you'd expect from someone with long-term, low-dose neurological damage. If a real person walked into a GP's surgery with Homer's symptom profile, obesity, memory problems, mood instability, weirdly high pain tolerance, chronic sleep disturbance, and they mentioned they'd worked at a nuclear plant for 30 years, the GP would not be cracking jokes about it. A fun detail I keep circling back to is from the very first Homer at the Plant episode. In the episode where Homer becomes safety inspector in the first place, he staged a protest about how unsafe the plant was. Burns offered him a promotion to shut him up. Burns' first instruction to him, the actual first thing he asked him to do, was to go out on the balcony and lie to the crowd and tell them the plant was safe. Homer refused. That was season 1. That refusal was the last time in the entire run of the show that the plant safety was honestly acknowledged by anyone with authority. Every season since, the plant has had accidents, and every season since, Homer the safety inspector has been present for them, and every season since, the plant has kept running. The town has never held a serious conversation about whether it should close. So if you buy the theory, here's what the show has been telling you, quietly, for decades. Homer works at a plant that has never been safe. He has been the person officially responsible for its safety since season 1. He has done that job badly, though not through malice, more through not noticing when he should have. The cumulative damage from that job is visible on his body and brain. The town drinks the water, eats the fish, breathes the air, and doesn't ask questions. The children don't age because their bodies can't age properly. The adults don't die because their bodies don't know how to die properly. everyone stays frozen in a very particular state of chronic low-grade illness that looks, from the outside, like being a cartoon. I want to be careful not to oversell this. The show is not actually written as environmental horror. It's written as comedy. The nuclear stuff is a joke that Matt Groening and the writers have written for as long as they have because it works, and because it gives them Mr. Burns, and because nuclear plants in 1989 were still scary enough to be funny. I don't think any of the writers sit down on a Monday morning and say, right, how do we further the radiation contamination reading of Homer Simpson today? They're just writing jokes. But what's interesting is that the jokes, taken together, form a consistent picture. Every nuclear gag they've written supports the theory, because the theory is just the gag taken seriously. If you pull back and look at the full run, the show has painted a picture of a town where everything weird can be traced back to one glowing building and one man who works inside it. The theory isn't adding anything that isn't on screen, it's just refusing to treat the gag as only a gag. And what I like about it, the thing that makes me want to come back to this theory when I'm thinking about Homer, is that it treats him with a particular kind of dignity. He's not stupid because he was born stupid. He's not stupid because of a crayon, necessarily. He's not stupid because his brain is a frozen dream. He's stupid because he's been slowly poisoned for 30 years at a job he took because he needed the money to pay for a house he could barely afford, to feed a family he loves. That's not a flattering story, but it's a sympathetic one. It gives the damage a cause. It lets Homer be a victim of something bigger than himself, which is, I suspect, what a lot of us secretly hope our own struggles are. I'll say one more thing about the nuclear stuff, and then we'll move on. There's a version of this theory that extends to the whole town and tries to explain everything weird about Springfield, why the mayor's so corrupt, why the police are useless, why no one can tell where the place is geographically, why it seems to be in a different state every time someone asks. The full version of the theory treats Springfield as a kind of closed ecosystem, collapsed into its own strangeness by decades of environmental mismanagement. I find that version a bit too much. I prefer the narrower version, the one that's just about Homer and his body, the man, the plant, and the cumulative cost of being there for as long as he's been there. But if you want to extend it, the pieces are there. You just have to be willing to look at The Simpsons and see it underneath the jokes as quite a bit sadder than it lets on, which, now that I say it out loud, is kind of the through line for all these theories. None of them are particularly cheerful. They're all, in their different ways, attempts to explain Homer by describing something that happened to him. And that raises a question the show itself doesn't often ask directly, but which sits underneath everything he does. It's a question about who Homer was before any of this. Before the plant, before the drinking, before he was the man we know. Which brings us to his mother. There's a scene in Mother Simpson, which is a season 7 episode from late 1995, where a younger Homer, maybe 9 or 10, wakes up in his bed in the middle of the night. His mother leans over him, kisses him on the forehead, and tells him she loves him. Then she's gone. He doesn't see her again for nearly 3 decades. That scene, for me, is the single most important piece of backstory in the entire run of The Simpsons, and the show itself has treated it that way. Mother Simpson is one of a small handful of episodes that the show's writers consistently cite as their best work. It's the one where Homer cries properly. Not a gag cry, not a single tear, actual grief. He sits on the hood of his car at the end of the episode after his mother has had to disappear again to escape the FBI, and he watches the stars and he doesn't say anything. The episode ends on that shot. No punchline, just Homer, alone, trying to hold on to a memory that keeps slipping. The backstory for anyone who hasn't seen the episode is that Homer's mother, Mona, was, in her youth, a countercultural type who got radicalized in the late 60s, in part in a bit of writing I find genuinely funny, by watching the hair of Joe Namath during a Super Bowl. She fell in with a group of hippies, helped destroy Mr. Burns' germ warfare lab with what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, and became a federal fugitive. To protect her family, she went underground. She kissed young Homer goodbye in the middle of the night and vanished. Abe Simpson, left to raise the boy alone, couldn't face explaining where she'd gone, so he told Homer she was dead. He took Homer to a grave and said it was hers. The grave was actually Walt Whitman's, because apparently in the Simpsons universe, the city of Springfield contains Walt Whitman's grave, and Abe had simply picked a convenient one. Homer doesn't find out the truth until his 30s. He stumbles across Mona by accident in the present day of the show, and the two of them have a brief, tearful reunion before the FBI turns up again and she has to run. Okay, so that's the canon. Here's the theory. Homer Simpson is emotionally frozen at around the age he was when his mother left. Everything you see him do as an adult, the tantrums, the food obsessions, the inability to think about consequences, the way he chases immediate pleasure and resents being asked to delay it, the way he defers all authority to Marge, the way a child defers to a mother, the way he's terrified of being abandoned but can't quite articulate it, all of that is consistent with a man who stopped developing emotionally at 9 years old. And the thing that makes this more than just an off-the-cuff fan theory is that the show has quietly built a lot of Homer's adult personality around it. Watch his scenes with Marge with this in mind, and it's everywhere. He runs to her when he's upset. He hides behind her when he's scared. He seeks her approval the way a boy seeks his mom's approval, not the way a husband seeks his wife's. He calls her constantly by names that position her as caregiver more than partner. She's the one who tells him whether he can have a beer. She's the one who decides when it's time to stop sulking. And when she threatens to leave, which has happened across multiple episodes, he absolutely falls apart. Not in a proportionate, adult, let's work through this way. He falls apart the way a 9-year-old falls apart when he thinks he's losing his mother. The theory says this isn't a coincidence. The specific trauma of Mona's disappearance, made worse by Abe's lie, has shaped Homer into someone for whom every woman he loves is partly a stand-in for the woman who left. Marge isn't just his wife. She's also, in a very quiet way, the person who promises she'll be there when he wakes up. The whole architecture of their relationship is held together by that reassurance, which is why when Marge is angry at him or disappointed in him or threatening to leave, he behaves the way a child behaves, because on some level he is one. Now, the thing I want to be honest about is that this reading is, on paper, a bit grim. It suggests that Homer has never grown up, will never grow up, and that his marriage to Marge is held together by an unacknowledged parent-child dynamic underneath the surface one. And I don't entirely buy all of that. I think the show gives Homer moments of genuine adult love for Marge that aren't about her being a mom substitute. And I think the relationship is more complicated than the theory lets it be. But I don't think the theory is wrong exactly. I think it's describing something real that's usually invisible to casual viewers. There's a reason why so many of Homer's most emotionally honest moments across the entire run of the show involve his mother, not his father, who he fights with constantly and treats as a bit of a joke, not his wife, who he loves in a way that's already fully integrated into his daily life, his mother, the person who was there for the first 9 years and then wasn't. When the show wants to break Homer, when it wants to go past the bluster and the donuts and the screaming at the television, it reaches for Mona. Because Mona is where Homer never quite closed up. And I think this is also, though I'll hedge a bit here, the best explanation for the drinking, which we'll get to properly in a later section. A man who stopped developing emotionally at 9 has very few tools for handling adult pain. Drinking is what you pick up when the actual skills aren't there. It's not the only reason Homer drinks, but it's in the mix. There's a follow-up episode to Mother Simpson called Mona Leavesa, which aired in season 19, 2008. In that one, Mona comes back, reconciles with Homer, and then dies. It's a surprisingly good episode for how late in the run it came, and it gives Homer closure he didn't really have before. He gets to know her properly for a little while. He gets to say goodbye on purpose this time. And then she's gone for real. What's striking is that the show, after that episode, mostly stops doing Mona storylines. There's a later one in season 32 where Homer reminisces about her on Mother's Day, and we learn that she secretly visited him and Abe at the hospital when Bart was born. She was there for the birth of her grandchild, she just couldn't announce herself. That detail, for what it's worth, is absolutely heartbreaking if you let it land. She got to see her son become a father. She didn't get to hug him. She had to pose as a doctor and then disappear again. The arrested development theory, in its full form, says that Homer has never really recovered from any of this. That even after the closure of Mona Lisa, even after knowing the truth, the 9-year-old boy who woke up to find his mother gone is still driving. The adult man eating donuts at his desk and yelling at Bart is being run from the inside by that boy. That boy never got to grow up because the grown-up world required skills he never learned, because his mother wasn't there to teach them. I think the reason this theory lands for me is that it reframes a lot of Homer's worst behavior. The cruelty, the selfishness, the tantrums, the way he occasionally makes Marge or Lisa cry. It doesn't excuse any of it, and I don't want it to excuse any of it, but it gives it a shape. It stops being inexplicable. Homer behaves the way he does because he's operating from a place that got frozen 30-odd years ago, and the equipment he's got for being an adult was never fully installed. That's a sadder reading of Homer than the jokey ones, but it's the one I keep coming back to when I rewatch Mother Simpson, which I do sometimes at about 1 in the morning when I want to remember that this cartoon show is capable of being a real thing. Anyway, there's one more piece I want to mention before we leave this topic: the way Homer behaves around his dad. Abe Simpson is a figure the show almost always plays for laughs, a senile old man in a nursing home, prone to long, boring stories that start in one decade and meander into another. But the relationship between him and Homer is, underneath the bits, extremely fraught. They argue constantly. They can't be in the same room for 5 minutes without one of them sulking. And the reason, if you take the theory seriously, is that Homer has never forgiven his father for the lie. Not specifically, not in a way he could articulate, but low level, underneath everything. Abe told him his mother was dead for nearly 30 years. Homer was a child when it happened. He has never properly let it go, and he probably never will. So when you see Homer and Abe bickering about something stupid, a remote control, a bowl of soup, the placement of a chair, you're not really watching a sitcom gag about an old man and his son. You're watching the residue of a much older hurt coming out in small, safe doses. The big hurt is too big, so it leaks out sideways, right? That's Mona. There's a reason that episode is one of the ones the writers are proudest of. It's the one where the show admitted Homer had a past, and admitted the past was doing something to him, and didn't try to fix it with a punchline. There's another episode, though, where the show did something even stranger. It held a mirror up to Homer and then killed the person holding the mirror. And that's where the whole idea of Homer as a coherent person really starts to fall apart. So picture this: a funeral, a coffin being lowered into the ground, the mourners standing in a loose semicircle, most of them wearing black. And Homer Simpson, in the middle of it all, has fallen asleep in a folding chair and is talking in his sleep about the television. He says something like, "Change the channel, Marge." And the mourners, instead of being horrified, laugh. All of them, including Reverend Lovejoy, including the man's former colleagues. The coffin keeps lowering. The laughter keeps going. Credits. That's how Homer's Enemy ends. The episode aired in 1997, season 8, and it's widely considered one of the 2 or 3 best episodes in the entire run of the show. It has the highest IMDb rating of any Simpsons episode, which is the kind of fact that sounds like it belongs in a different video, but I'm going to mention it once because it matters here. The thing people miss sometimes about why Homer's Enemy is so highly regarded is that it's not actually an episode about a character called Frank Grimes. It's an episode where the show briefly and quite deliberately audits itself, takes a long, honest look at the man at its center, and then, having seen what it's seen, kills the witness and walks away. The setup is simple. Frank Grimes is a new hire at the nuclear plant. His backstory, as the show explains it in a deliberately overwrought news segment, is that he was orphaned as a child, worked his way through correspondence school, suffered various industrial accidents, and eventually, through sheer grind, earned a degree in nuclear physics. Burns sees the news report, decides to hire him as an executive, then forgets by the next day and assigns him to Sector 7G, where, naturally, he ends up sharing an office with Homer. Grimes meets Homer, immediately dislikes him, watches Homer nearly drink sulfuric acid thinking it was beer, and intervenes to save his life. The intervention breaks the cafeteria wall. Homer, rather than thanking Grimes, blames him. Grimes gets his salary docked. From that moment, Grimes declares that he and Homer are enemies. Now, what makes this episode different from basically every other Simpsons episode is that Grimes is not wrong. He's not slightly wrong. He's not interestingly wrong. He's right about everything. Homer is lazy, unqualified, dangerous, incompetent, and somehow, despite all of that, thriving. Homer has a wife, 3 children, 2 cars, a house, a dog, a cat, a backyard, a barbecue, a job. He's been an astronaut. He's won a Grammy. He's toured with the Smashing Pumpkins. He's befriended former presidents. He has, across the run of the show up to that point, lived a life that no actual human being would be able to assemble. And Frank Grimes, a man who earned everything he has through decades of miserable work, cannot understand how this is possible. The episode has Homer invite Grimes around for dinner, trying to patch things up. Marge makes lobster. Grimes arrives at a beautiful home on Evergreen Terrace, sees Bart, sees Lisa, sees the family photographs, sees Homer's various accolades on the wall, and has something close to a breakdown. He gives a speech pointing at each thing that is essentially an itemized list of reasons Homer's life shouldn't exist. A dream house, 2 cars, a beautiful wife, a son who owns a factory. The part about the factory is a reference to a subplot I won't get into, but it adds to the overall unreality. Grimes leaves. He tells Marge and the children politely that it was nice to meet them. And then he goes back to his 1-room apartment, which is located, the episode emphasizes, between 2 bowling alleys, and he starts planning something. The something he plans is to expose Homer, to get the plant to recognize that Homer is, as Grimes puts it to Lenny and Carl, a danger and a fraud, and to get him fired. Grimes tricks Homer into entering a design-your-own power plant contest, not realizing or pretending not to realize that the contest is for children. Homer submits a diorama, a crude, badly glued cardboard model with fins and a racing stripe. And Burns, who is supposed to be judging the contest, awards Homer first prize. Ralph Wiggum, who'd entered a Malibu Stacy dream house, comes second. Martin Prince, whose entry was a functional futuristic design that was literally powering the auditorium's lights, comes third. Grimes watches this happen, watches Homer receive a standing ovation, watches the whole room applaud a grown man who has just won a children's contest with a cardboard box. And something breaks in him. He runs through the plant shouting that he is Homer Simpson. He imitates Homer's worst habits, eating like a slob, skipping safety protocols, peeing on the seat of the toilet. He's trying to prove a point that if Homer can get away with this, anyone can, that the world has lost its mind. He reaches a high-voltage cable and in the final act of his breakdown declares that he doesn't need safety gloves because he is Homer Simpson. He grabs the cable, he's killed instantly. And at his funeral, Homer sleeps through the eulogy and mutters about the television, and everyone laughs. I want to be really clear about what I think this episode is doing because it's sometimes misread. The surface reading is that Frank Grimes is the audience surrogate. He looks at Homer's life and says what any of us would say if we were actually there. He's the real-world voice in the cartoon world. He's the counter-argument the show has been waiting to give itself permission to voice. And the show, and having him lose, is telling us, the viewers, that the Simpsons universe is a closed system and that anyone who imports real-world logic into it will be destroyed. That's true as far as it goes. But I think there's a deeper thing happening, which is that the episode is the show's own acknowledgement that Homer doesn't make sense, that you can't explain him, that if you take him seriously as a character, as a man with a history and consequences, the numbers don't add up. Frank Grimes dies because he was trying to do the arithmetic. The show is saying, quietly but firmly, that the arithmetic doesn't work. And from that episode onwards, the show mostly stopped trying to make it work. A lot of people cite Homer's enemy as the moment the character shifted, the pivot between what fans call classic Homer and what they call jerk-ass Homer. The Homer of season 9 and onwards is meaner, louder, more cartoonish, more capable of being wrong in ways that hurt his family. The sweet oaf of season 3 gets replaced by someone a bit harder to love. And while the shift probably has more to do with writers' room turnover than with any single episode, it's striking that Homer's enemy sits right at the boundary. The show took one honest look at the character and then, as if unsettled by what it saw, stopped pretending he was a real person and leaned fully into him being a force of nature. The theory, then, in its full form, is this. Frank Grimes was right. Homer cannot logically exist. The show, in writing Homer's enemy, admitted this to itself and gave up trying to reconcile him with realism. Every episode since has been, in some sense, an acknowledgement that the character is a closed system, that he doesn't need to track with the real world, that he is what he is because he is. And that acknowledgement freed the show up to get stranger, broader, more surreal, more willing to use him as a vehicle for whatever the writers wanted that week. There's a version of this reading I find quite moving, actually, which is that Homer's enemy is the show's most sincere tribute to its own central character. It's saying, here's the only episode where we tried to look at him as you would look at a real person, and here's what happened. We couldn't do it. The attempt produced a character who broke under the weight of it, and so we had to kill him to keep going. Not because we're cruel, but because the show cannot contain both Frank Grimes and Homer Simpson at the same time. One of them has to be the shape of reality, and the show chose Homer. I want to mention something specific that I think is underrated about the episode, the funeral scene. Homer talking in his sleep, everyone laughing. On a surface read, it's a grim joke. The survivor of the story showing no awareness that he caused the other man's death. But if you watch it carefully, the people laughing aren't laughing maliciously. Lisa is there. Marge is there. Bart is there. They're laughing because Homer being Homer is genuinely funny to them, and Grimes, in trying to destroy that, destroyed himself. There's no villain in this episode. Not really. There's just Homer, who can't help being what he is, and Grimes, who couldn't stop himself trying to fight it, and the cost of that fight was Grimes. The last shot of the episode isn't cruelty. It's, if anything, the show's quiet argument that reality can only fight Homer for so long. Eventually, reality loses. That's not a triumphant thought. It's not really a tragic one either. It's just the show looking at its own protagonist and accepting what he is. Which, now I think about it, is probably the most honest thing the show has ever done about Homer. Before or since. Anyway. If Homer's enemy is the show admitting that Homer can't be explained by realism, that raises an interesting follow-up question. If he doesn't track with real-world logic, what kind of logic does he track with? And the answer, which we've been circling for a few sections now, is time. Homer tracks with a different kind of time than the rest of us do, which is maybe the strangest thing about him of all. Here's a thing I worked out fairly recently and then couldn't stop thinking about. Homer Simpson has personally lived through every major event of American life since the late 60s. He's experienced Woodstock, or at least adjacent to it. He's lived through the end of the Vietnam War. He's lived through Nixon's resignation. He's lived through the entire Reagan era. He's lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall. He's lived through the dot-com boom. He's lived through 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of social media, the Trump presidency, the pandemic, the rise of AI, and whatever else has happened between when I wrote this and when you're watching it. He's been there for all of it. And he's been at every single one of those moments, about 39 years old. That's the floating timeline. It's a writing convention. It's also, if you sit with it, genuinely strange, Most sitcoms don't really deal with this problem because most sitcoms don't last long enough. A show runs for 8 seasons, 10 if it's lucky, and the characters age in something close to real time, or they age a bit more slowly but you don't really notice. The Simpsons, because it's been on for a kind of laughably long time, can't do this. If Homer aged in real time, he'd have to be in his 70s by now. Bart would be almost 50, Lisa would be pushing 45, Maggie would be a fully grown adult. None of which is tenable for the show the writers are actually making, which is a show about a family with 3 young kids. So the solution is the floating timeline. Characters don't age. Flashbacks keep re-anchoring. The past is a rolling buffer that shifts forward every few years. The Way We Was, which aired in season 2, showed Homer and Marge meeting as teenagers in 1974. A much later episode, That 90s Show, retconned that and had them meeting as young adults in the mid-90s. Later episodes have quietly moved the goalposts again. Homer's teenage years have drifted through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and by now probably the early 2000s. Whatever decade the show needs to reference for its jokes, the show rewrites Homer's youth to have taken place in that decade, which is fine as a writing convenience. But as a metaphysical situation, it's bonkers. It means that Homer Simpson has, at different points in the show's history, been a teenager in the 70s, the 90s, and the 2000s, and all of those are canonically true. He was a hippie, he was a grunge kid, he was probably on MySpace. He doesn't remember any of them contradicting because he's the person living inside the dream. And the dream doesn't know it's contradicting itself. There are a few different ways to read this. One way is the boring way, which is to just accept it as a convention and not think about it. The writers need Homer to have been a teenager in whatever decade their current joke requires, so they rewrite his backstory accordingly. The audience, bless us, largely doesn't notice. Most viewers aren't paying enough attention to clock the contradictions, and the ones who are paying enough attention have generally decided it's not worth being annoyed about. Another way is the coma theory way, which we covered earlier. If Homer's in a dream, it doesn't matter what decade he was a teenager in because dreams don't obey linear time. The dream can rewrite its own backstory as many times as it wants. Homer is a 39-year-old in an eternal present, and his past is whatever the dreamer needs it to be at any given moment. But there's a third reading, which is the one I find most interesting, and it treats the floating timeline less as a contradiction to be explained and more as its own kind of fact about Homer. Homer exists outside linear time. Not because he's in a coma, not because he's dead, not because he's in purgatory, although we'll get to that reading in a bit. Simply because that's what he is. He's a kind of eternal middle-aged man, perpetually 39, perpetually in the middle of his life, perpetually about to sort things out once he's finished this beer. He can't end, he can't age, he can't resolve. He just keeps going. And the more I sit with that reading, the more it tells me about who Homer is, because the state of being stuck at 39 forever is a very specific kind of state. It's the state of a man in the middle of his life who hasn't yet admitted he's in the middle. He still thinks there's time. He still thinks the big changes are ahead of him. He's going to stop drinking, probably. He's going to get a better job, probably. He's going to be a better father, probably. Just not today. Today, he's going to watch some television and have a lie down. Every sitcom dad who doesn't change is a version of this, but Homer is the longest running version of it. He's been about to change for nearly 4 decades, nearly 40 years of real-world time, frozen in a single year of fictional time. The man has had the same problems for longer than most people have been married, and he is never, ever going to solve any of them, because solving them would mean moving forward, and he can't. There's an old line, and I'm probably misremembering who said it, that the loneliest thing in the world is being the only person in a room who can't change. I think about that line a lot when I think about Homer, because the rest of the show's universe does change in small ways. Maud Flanders died. Apu's kids grew up. Mona Simpson came back and died and is gone. Things happen, time moves, just not to Homer. Homer stays. A fun detail I want to mention here because it's a genuinely strange coincidence. The name Homer, as in the Greek one, as in the actual ancient poet, refers to the man who wrote, among other things, the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is, for what it's worth, a story about a man who spends a very long time trying to get home and keeps being prevented from doing so by forces beyond his control. The original Homer's protagonist is stuck in a loop. He can't finish his journey. The gods keep pulling him back. Every time he gets close to the end, something drags him off course. I don't think Matt Groening named the character after the Greek poet for this reason. I'm fairly sure he named him after his own father, whose name was Homer Groening. But the coincidence is a bit perfect, isn't it? Our Homer also can't finish, also keeps getting pulled back, also goes on endless detours. And at the end of each one, he's no closer to home than when he started. The Odyssey is a finite story. It has an ending. Our Homer's story is infinite. That's the only real difference. The last thing I want to say about the floating timeline, and then I'll stop, is that it's the thing that makes the coma theory, the radiation theory, the purgatory theory, and the dying dream theory all functionally equivalent. All of those theories are attempts to explain the same underlying fact, which is that Homer is stuck. Whether he's stuck because he's dreaming, or stuck because his body has mutated past the point of being able to age, or stuck because he's dead and waiting for something, or stuck because his mother left and he never grew up, the shape of the stuckness is the same. The theories are just different names for the same condition, which leaves you, if you sit with it long enough, with a single question, not whether Homer is any of these things specifically, but why the fans keep reaching for explanations that involve imprisonment. The coma is a prison, the radiation is a prison, purgatory is a prison, arrested development is a prison. Every theory we've looked at so far describes Homer as trapped. None of them describe him as free. I don't think that's an accident. I think it tells us something about how Homer reads on screen to the people who love him most. He reads as a man who cannot get out. The specific nature of the cage is up for debate. The cage is not, right? That's the floating timeline, a condition of the character so fundamental that you almost can't see it until someone points it out, and then you can't unsee it. Homer exists in an eternal present. He has been about to change for as long as the show has been on. And the show, which at this point is closing in on 40 years of continuous production, has given no indication that it intends to release him. Which brings me awkwardly to something I've been putting off talking about, because it's the bit of the show that's got harder to rewatch as I've got older, and it's the one I suspect a lot of you have been waiting to hear me address. The strangling gag. I want to be careful with this section, not because the topic is difficult to talk about exactly, but because I think it's really easy to talk about it badly. Either you sound like you're outraged on behalf of a cartoon child, which is silly, or you sound like you're excusing something you shouldn't be excusing, which is worse. I'm going to try to just describe what's in the show and what people have made of it, and let you sit with it however you sit with it. The gag, if you've managed to never see the show somehow, is this. Bart does something to annoy Homer. Homer says, "Why, you little," and lunges forward, grabs Bart by the throat, and shakes him back and forth with both hands. Bart's tongue sticks out, his eyes bulge, he makes a throttled choking noise. Homer stops. The show moves on. It's been a running gag since almost the very beginning, early season 1. It's part of the visual grammar of the show, the way Homer's dough is part of its audio grammar, the way the couch gag is part of its opening. You can't have The Simpsons without, somewhere in the average episode, at least a token version of the strangling. Even people who've never watched a full episode of the show know the gag. It's one of the most recognizable comedic beats in the history of television. The theory, which at this point is less a theory and more just a description of what's on screen, is that this is a depiction of child abuse being played for laughs. And the show, to its credit or otherwise, has been perfectly willing to admit this when pushed. There's an episode in season 22 called "Love is a Many Strangled Thing." The setup is that Homer has humiliated Bart at a football game, and Marge sends him to a therapist, a man named Dr. Xander. During the therapy session, Homer almost casually mentions that he strangles his son. The therapist reasonably reacts as a therapist would react, which is to say he's horrified. And he brings in, I'm not making this up, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketball player, to role-play as Homer and strangle Homer, so Homer can experience what he's been doing to his son from the other end. It works. Or seems to work. Homer becomes genuinely afraid of Bart, because he now understands viscerally what strangling feels like. He stops doing it. Now, if the episode had ended there, that would have been one thing. A Simpsons episode that ultimately came down against the strangling. That said, actually, this is not okay. Homer has been doing something wrong. Let's stop. But that's not how the episode ends. The episode ends by showing that without Homer's strangling, Bart's behavior becomes completely out of control. He runs wild. He causes mayhem. He does increasingly awful things because there are no consequences. And the episode's resolution is that the strangling was actually necessary. It was the discipline that kept Bart in check. Dr. Xander, defeated by what he's seeing, ends up strangling Bart himself out of frustration. The gag returns. The status quo resumes. So the show, in that one episode, acknowledged the thing, interrogated it, and then endorsed it. And the gag has continued every season since, with no meaningful interruption. There was a small flurry of discussion in 2024 about whether the strangling was finally being retired, after a season 35 episode seemed to suggest something had changed, but the show's executive producer, James L. Brooks, came out fairly firmly and said they weren't changing anything. The gag is part of the show, it's part of Homer, it's part of Bart, and it's going to keep happening. A lot of fans over the years have pointed out that the strangling looks different depending on which era of the show you're watching. In the early seasons, it's cartoonish, quick, rubbery. Bart bounces back instantly. The violence is clearly violence, but also clearly stylized. It reads in those episodes like a visual quote of earlier animated violence, like Tom and Jerry, where the conceit is that nothing actually hurts because the medium doesn't allow for pain. In later seasons, this shifts, not in every episode, but in enough of them to notice. The strangling gets longer, the choking sounds get more prolonged. Bart's reactions get a little more strained. The show, almost imperceptibly, starts drawing it more like a real man hurting a real child. I'm not saying this is intentional, I think it's just what happens when the show's animators get better, and the general trend of television pushes toward a slightly darker realism. But the effect is that the gag, as the decades have accumulated, has become harder to watch. Not because the gag itself has changed, but because we've changed, and the show's version of the gag has quietly drifted along with us. And I'll be honest, I find it hard to watch now. Not impossible. I still watch the show. But the strangling in recent seasons reads differently to me than it did when I was a kid watching it, and I suspect that's true for a lot of longtime viewers. The comedy hasn't shifted, our tolerance has. The theory in its fullest form is that The Simpsons is, whatever else it is, a decades-long document of how American pop culture has normalized domestic violence, specifically violence against children, by laundering it through humor. This is a bigger claim than I want to fully endorse, but I don't want to dismiss it either. The gag is what it is. The show knows what it is. It's chosen to keep doing it. And the choice to keep doing it, frankly, means something. There's a thing I find genuinely chilling about the strangling, and I want to say it even though it's dark, because I think it's true. Homer's own father, Abe Simpson, was emotionally abusive to Homer. The show has shown this clearly across many episodes. Abe is dismissive, cruel, and occasionally violent. He tells Homer across the run of the show that he's disappointed in him, that he should have been more like his half-brother Herb, that he knew Homer would amount to nothing. Abe is not a good father. He has not been a good father at any point Homer can remember. And Homer has internalized this. The strangling is something Homer does to his son that Homer's father, in various ways, did to him. It is the cycle. It is the thing the show keeps quietly reminding you of every time Homer's hands close around Bart's throat. He is repeating what was done to him. He doesn't know how to be a father who doesn't do this because the father he had didn't show him how. That's not a theory exactly. That's just what's on screen. The show has shown you Homer's childhood. It has shown you Abe. It has shown you what Homer learned. And then it has shown you Homer doing to his son what was done to him, week after week, season after season. I want to say something about Bart here too while I'm on it. Bart is, canonically, a child who has been strangled by his father hundreds of times across his life. If you take the floating timeline seriously, which we talked about in the last section, Bart is a 10-year-old who has lived through decades of this, emotionally, if not temporally. The show occasionally acknowledges this. Bart has moments scattered across the run where he seems to be aware that something is wrong with the way his father treats him. He talks to therapists. He runs away. He expresses in quiet moments that he wants to be loved and isn't sure if he is. But those moments never escalate. They're always contained within an episode. By the next week, Bart is back to being the cheeky 10-year-old causing mischief, and Homer is back to strangling him when he does. The cycle resets. The damage doesn't compound because the show doesn't let it compound. The show has a status quo to protect. This is, if you think about it too hard, the show's deepest and quietest cruelty. Not the strangling itself, but the refusal to let Bart's experience of the strangling accumulate. Bart is not allowed to carry forward from one episode to the next the weight of what happens to him. He has to go back to being 10 years old, fresh, not damaged, ready for next week's plot. The strangling wipes itself each week. Bart doesn't get to remember, which is, I realize, an even sadder reading than I meant to give. I'll stop there. I've been pretty heavy about this, and sleep content isn't supposed to make you feel worse, so let me just land this section and move on. The strangling is in the show. It's going to stay in the show. Whether you read it as a gag, as an abuse cycle, as a document of American tolerance for domestic violence, or as just the way The Simpsons looks, is up to you. I don't think there's a single right answer. I think the show wants you to be able to watch it as a gag. And I think the show also knows that the gag is more than a gag. And I think those two readings have been sitting uneasily next to each other for 35 years, waiting for someone to decide which one wins. No one ever will. The gag outlasts the argument. Moving on, let's talk about something a bit lighter, or rather, something a bit more regularly miserable in a socially sanctioned way. Let's talk about Homer's drinking. Moe's Tavern, if you picture it, is a brown room. Wood paneling, sticky floor, a few stools, a jukebox that probably hasn't worked properly since the mid-90s. One small window that lets in hardly any light because Moe cleans it approximately never. There's a bathroom in the back that everyone avoids unless desperate. There's a pool table with the felt rubbed through in the middle. And at one specific seat at the bar, first from the left, you'll find Homer Simpson, most days after work, and often before work, and sometimes instead of work. He's been drinking at Moe's since the late 80s. That's not a stat I'm trying to do much with. It's just context. The man has a specific stool, a specific routine, and a specific relationship with the man behind the bar. That is, underneath the jokes, one of the most psychologically developed relationships in the show. Here's the theory. Homer Simpson is an alcoholic, not a cartoon drunk, not a sitcom dad who has a beer after work and makes a face. A proper, clinical, decades-deep alcoholic whose condition has been normalized by the show to the point where most viewers don't actively register it. The evidence, once you start looking for it, is overwhelming. He drinks in virtually every episode. He drinks at the plant, he drinks at home, he drinks at Moe's, he drinks at parties, at weddings, at funerals, at breakfast, occasionally on duty as the plant's safety inspector. He keeps beer in his car, he keeps beer in his desk. He keeps beer in the fridge, obviously, which for Homer seems to be primarily a beer storage device that sometimes also contains food. He has driven drunk so many times across the run of the show that driving drunk has, in his hands, stopped being a plot point and become just a thing he does on Tuesdays. He's gone to AA, I think. Actually, I want to be careful about which bits I'm remembering accurately. He has definitely given up beer for a short stretch in season 4 in an episode called Duffless, which is genuinely one of my favorite episodes. He agrees to give up beer for a month to prove to Marge he can. He goes through it. He suffers. He emerges on the other side of the month, takes Marge on a bike ride, and the episode ends with them riding into a sunset while a love song plays. It's sweet. It's genuine. The show treats the moment with real tenderness. And then, in the very next episode, Homer is back to drinking. No follow-through, no continuation, no reflection on whether he might want to, keep it up. The month of sobriety becomes a discrete narrative event that the show never revisits, and Homer's drinking carries on exactly as before, which is, for what it's worth, exactly how real alcoholism works. A period of sobriety, then relapse, then normalization of the relapse, then eventual forgetting that the sober period ever happened. The show has, whether it meant to or not, accurately depicted the cycle. The genius or the horror, depending on how you look at it, is that the show has built a character around Homer specifically to reassure the audience that Homer isn't the one with the drinking problem. That character is Barney Gumble. Barney is Homer's best friend since kindergarten. He is the show's resident drunk. He's the one who's unkempt, who belches at inappropriate moments, who passes out, who pukes, who has a proper, obvious alcoholism problem that the show is willing to let you see. And because Barney exists, Homer looks functional. Homer goes home at the end of the night. Homer holds down a job. Homer has a family. Homer isn't Barney. Homer is fine. Barney is the scapegoat. He's there to let you not worry about Homer. And eventually, in the later seasons, the show lets Barney get sober. He joins AA. He cleans up. He becomes, after Apu's departure, the character with the most stable sobriety arc in the town. And crucially, Homer does not join him. Homer is the one person in their group who stays drinking after Barney stops. The show does not comment on this. It doesn't point the camera at the contrast. It just lets Barney go dry and lets Homer keep ordering Duff. And the narrative implication, if you're paying attention, is that the real alcoholic in the friendship was never the one you thought it was. I actually think this is quite clever writing in a queasy way. The show spent years training you to see Barney as the cautionary tale and Homer as the functional one. Then it flipped, and the flip is so quiet you could watch 20 seasons and miss it. There's a bit I always come back to about the way Homer's drinking is framed at home. Duff beer is everywhere in the house. It's in the fridge at all times, multiple cans, it's on the coffee table. Homer drinks it on the sofa while watching telly. He drinks it at dinner. He drinks it occasionally in the morning, though the show doesn't play those moments as alarming. They're just texture. And Duff exists in the real world as a licensed product. You can buy Duff beer. There's a Duff brewery at Universal Studios. The show's engagement with its own drinking culture is so deep that it's literally in the alcohol business, narratively speaking. Which is, I want to say clearly, not a criticism, it's just a fact. The show and Duff and Homer's alcoholism are a single economic unit. The theory I'm describing here is not especially radical. Plenty of writers have said this over the years. Homer Simpson is a functional alcoholic dressed up as a comedic dad whose addiction has been so thoroughly normalized by 3 decades of television that most of the audience reads it as personality rather than pathology. The theory isn't really about uncovering something hidden. It's about recognizing what's been in plain sight. But stack this alongside the other theories we've walked through, and it starts looking less like an isolated bit of character business and more like a capstone. Radiation damage, arrested development from Mona leaving, a childhood of Abe's cruelty, a brain that may or may not be functioning with a piece of colored wax in it, a job he shouldn't have at a plant he can't fix, a wife he loves, but can't fully be present for, children he loves but can't properly parent, a friend, Barney, who managed to get out of the drinking while he couldn't, a life he's quietly aware isn't what it should be but can't see his way out of. And then, on top of all of that, a bar 2 blocks from his house, staffed by a man who knows him by name, where the beer is cheap and the company's undemanding and the question of what's wrong never has to come up. Because you don't ask a man at a bar what's wrong, you just pour him another one. It's not surprising he drinks. That's what I'm getting at. Every single thing about his life, read honestly, points towards drinking as the obvious outcome. He drinks because he's in pain. He's in pain for reasons he doesn't fully understand and couldn't articulate if he did. The drinking is the only way he's worked out to keep functioning despite the pain. And the show has been showing you, year after year, a man who has solved the problem of being himself by being drunk most of the time. I'm going to stop there with the diagnosis stuff because I'm not a doctor and I'm not Homer's therapist, and I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing about a cartoon man. But I think it's worth saying out loud, at least once, that the joke everyone laughs at, Homer stumbling home from Moe's, is not actually funny if you look at it from certain angles. It's a man self-medicating an unspoken sadness by spending his evenings in a brown room with a stranger who pours him alcohol until he can't think straight. That's a specific kind of life. A lot of people live it. The show has been holding up a very accurate portrait of it for a very long time and calling it comedy. The last thing I want to say about this, and then we'll move on, is a small kind thing about Moe. Moe has, across the run of the show, repeatedly shown that he's actually quite fond of Homer. He cares about him. He does small, thoughtful things for him. He remembers his orders. He looks out for him when he's had too much. He once walked Homer home in an episode we'll get to later. Moe is not just a bartender. He's, in his own limited bar owner way, one of the people in Homer's life who consistently shows up for him. Which is maybe the saddest bit of all. A man who should probably not be drinking has, in the bar where he drinks, a friend who genuinely cares about him and who keeps pouring him beer anyway because that's the job. Nobody in Homer's life is set up to help him stop, including, in some ways, the people who love him most. Which brings us naturally enough to Marge, the prom. That's where I want to start this one. Not the wedding, the prom, Springfield High School, 1974 or 1994, or whenever the floating timeline currently has it. I've given up keeping track. Marge Bouvier and Homer Simpson are 17 years old, or thereabouts. They've been sort of dating in the sort of way that high school kids sort of date, where the dating mostly consists of Homer pestering Marge to notice him, and Marge being, understandably, more interested in a different boy called Artie Ziff. Artie Ziff, if you don't remember him, is everything Homer isn't. He's articulate, he's ambitious, he's academically successful, he's the captain of the debate team. He's the kind of boy whose future is, from the outside, obviously bright. He's going places. Homer, meanwhile, is a bit of a mess. A working-class lad who can't stop getting sent to detention and who's lying about speaking French to get tutoring sessions with Marge. Marge picks Artie. On the night of the prom, she's his date. They get crowned prom king and queen. She dances with him. She's having, by all appearances, a lovely evening. Homer goes to the prom alone, having bought a tux and a limousine he can't afford, and sits in the hallway crying because the girl he loves has chosen someone better than him, which on paper is the correct choice. Later that night, Artie takes Marge to Inspiration Point and tries to force himself on her. It doesn't work. She gets out of the car and she has to walk home in her prom dress. On the way home, she runs into Homer, who's been sitting alone in his limo eating a lobster he had bought for her. She gets in with him. They drive home together. She realizes right at that moment that Homer is the one she actually wants. That the clever, ambitious boy who was going places turned out to be awful, and the stupid, sweet boy who was going nowhere turned out to be kind. That's The Way We Was, Season 2, 1991. One of the early episodes where the show proved it could do proper emotional storytelling. And it's the origin story of Marge's entire relationship with Homer, the moment of her decision. Here's the theory, or rather the two theories, because the fan discourse around Marge and Homer's marriage has been split down the middle for 30-odd years, and both sides have evidence. Theory 1, Marge is settling. She's been settling since the moment she chose Homer. She's a brilliant, creative, intelligent woman who, because of circumstances beyond her control, ended up tied to a man who can barely function. And the show is a decades-long document of her quietly drowning in a life she didn't quite choose on purpose. The episodes where she almost leaves there are multiple, are the moments where the mask slips and the audience gets to see what's really going on. Jacques, the bowling instructor, the French lover in one of the 90s Separation episodes, the professor she had an affair with emotionally in that 90s show. All of those are Marge briefly contemplating a different life. And in every case, she comes back to Homer because she's trapped, or because she thinks she's trapped, or because the show needs her to come back to him so that the show can continue. Theory 2. Marge genuinely loves Homer, not in spite of what he is, but because of what he is. She sees something in him that nobody else sees, or at least that most people stop seeing after they meet him. And she stays not out of obligation, but out of real affection for a man who, for all his faults, is kind to her in specific ways that matter. She knows he's not the sharpest, she knows he drinks too much, she knows he's often wrong about things that shouldn't be difficult. She also knows that he loves her, really loves her, not in a functional way, but in the bone-deep kind of way where he would, and has, given up things that mattered to him to be with her. And her choice to stay with him is not a surrender, it's a choice, made freely, again and again. Both of these readings are supported by the show. That's the first thing I want to say. The show has done episodes that support each of them, sometimes in the same season, sometimes in the same episode. There is no clean answer. The evidence for the settling reading is extensive. Marge has been accepted to Springfield University. She has written novels. She has run for mayor. She has had career opportunities that Homer has, whether through malice or stupidity, interfered with, sometimes both. There is a specific episode where Homer proudly declares that he stopped Marge from going to college because he wanted her to himself, and the show plays the line both as funny and as genuinely troubling. Marge's life in almost every way that matters is smaller than it could have been, and Homer is, if we're being honest, a significant reason for that. The evidence for the genuine love reading is also extensive. Marge has chosen Homer over and over at points where she could have left. She kept the heart-shaped stone she and Homer broke in half as teenagers. Homer kept his half too. 3 decades later, that stone turns out to matter to both of them. In the season 20 episode where Homer almost loses her, he remembers their entire relationship in flashes. And the show uses those flashes to make a specific argument, which is that Homer loves Marge with a kind of simplicity that Artie Ziff was never capable of. Not cleverer, not better, simpler. And for Marge, in her specific life, with her specific mother and her specific sisters, and the specific version of herself she wanted to be, that simpler love was the one she wanted. I find myself, when I sit with this, leaning slightly toward the genuine love reading, but I don't want to oversell it. The evidence for settling is real. I just think the show, when it's at its best, is telling a more complicated story than either theory allows. Here's the thing. Artie Ziff as a character returns multiple times. Across the run of the show, Marge gets occasional glimpses of what her life would have looked like if she'd stayed with him. And every single time, the show has her come away relieved that she didn't. Artie is always a worse person than Homer. He's shallower, crueler, more self-absorbed. He's a man who looks like he's going somewhere, but what he actually is, under the suit and the achievements, is a brat. The show is making an argument there. It's not an argument I would necessarily agree with in the real world, because in the real world, plenty of men who look like Artie Ziff turn out to actually be lovely, and plenty of men who look like Homer turn out to be quite a bit worse than he is. But the show is doing a specific thing, which is asking you to believe that Marge chose the kinder man. that the surface indicators of success, the cleverness and the ambition and the social polish, can cover up a meaner person underneath, and that Homer, for all his obvious flaws, is at his core a genuinely good-hearted man, and that goodness is the rare thing, the thing worth choosing. I want to mention one specific scene because it stops me every time I see it. There's an episode called Secrets of a Successful Marriage, where Homer, having convinced himself he's an expert on marriage, starts teaching a night class about it. Running out of material, he starts telling the class all of Marge's private secrets. Marge finds out. She kicks him out. He has to sleep in the treehouse. Eventually, he comes home and begs her to take him back. His speech, when he gives it, is not a charming apology. It's not witty. It's not smart. He just tells her straight that he needs her because without her, he has nobody. That's it. That's the whole argument. I need you because without you, I have no one. And Marge takes him back. On one reading, that scene is devastating in the settling direction. A grown man who has no emotional resources of his own, admitting that he's using his wife as his entire support system, and his wife deciding to continue being that support system because she can't quite bring herself not to. That's codependency with a sitcom soundtrack. On another reading, it's the most honest thing Homer has ever said to her, and Marge honors the honesty by taking him back. Because honesty about need is, for Homer, a difficult thing to get to. He usually covers it with jokes and bluster. The moments when he just says the true thing are rare, and they mean something. I don't know which reading is right. I suspect both are. The marriage is both things, a trap and a choice, a cage and a home. Marge has been settling, and Marge has been genuinely in love, often simultaneously, for longer than most actual marriages last. That's not a failure of the writing. It's the writing being true to how real marriages actually work. Most of them are a bit of both, and I think the reason this theory keeps coming up, every generation of Simpsons fans takes it up again with slightly different emphasis, is that the marriage at the center of the show is one of the most honestly drawn sitcom marriages in television history. It doesn't look perfect, it doesn't look terrible, it looks real, which is, for a cartoon, genuinely quite impressive. Right. Marge, the love of Homer's life. The woman who chose him twice, first in the back of a limo on prom night, and then every day after that for the next several decades. You can call it a trap if you want. You can call it true love if you want. I think the show has been daring you to do either for a very long time, and both answers are available. Let's go somewhere slightly more fun, if fun is the right word. Let's talk about whether Homer might in fact be dead. So Homer has died on screen a lot of times, not in the everyday throwaway gag sense, though there's that too, but in the proper screen goes white, St. Peter at the gates, full-blown afterlife sequence sense. He's been to heaven, he's been to hell, he's talked to God on multiple occasions, he's been rejected from heaven for insufficient good deeds and sent back to earth as a ghost. He's been sent to hell for eating a broccoli. Entire Treehouse of Horror segments have been built around his various deaths and transmigrations. If you tried to assemble a coherent theological afterlife for Homer Simpson from everything the show has established, you'd have a theologically incoherent document of genuinely remarkable length. Most of those deaths, to be fair, are Treehouse of Horror material, which is explicitly non-canonical. The Treehouse specials are the show's annual permission slip to do whatever it wants, kill whoever it wants, show whatever genre of horror it wants, and then reset everything by the following week. So technically, none of the canonical Homer is necessarily dead. But there's a theory that says, actually, one of them did take, and the show has been telling you that for years if you've been paying attention. The theory is that Homer Simpson died a long time ago, and everything since is a form of purgatory. This is the deep-cut version of the coma theory. Same basic shape, different flavor. Instead of a coma, death. Instead of a dream, an afterlife. The specific death varies depending on which fan you ask, but the most common candidate is an injury from one of the very early seasons that should have killed him and canonically didn't. From that point, the theory says everything is post-mortem. Homer's soul has been kept by some cosmic bureaucracy in a kind of simulated version of his ordinary life. And the simulation is the purgatory. He doesn't know he's dead. He can't know. That's the nature of the condition. Let me walk through what the theory has going for it. First, the sheer quantity of afterlife content in the show. It's striking. Homer goes to heaven in a regular episode, not a treehouse one, in season 16, in an episode called Thank God It's Doomsday. He convinces himself the rapture is coming, climbs to the top of Springfield Mesa to await it, and at 3:15 p.m. on the predicted day, nothing happens. He realizes he got the day wrong, goes back the next night, and this time he actually gets taken up. He floats through space. He ends up in heaven, sees what's happened to his family who have been left behind to be tormented by the devil, and ends up having a full-blown conversation with God about whether Earth can be restored. God, being God, agrees. Time is rewound. Homer wakes up at the mesa as if none of it had happened. That episode is not a treehouse of horror, it's a regular canon episode. The show, in its main continuity, sent Homer to heaven, had him negotiate with God, and brought him back. That happened. You can look it up. Second, the number of episodes that frame Homer as existing on the edge of death. Near heart attacks, triple bypasses, coma episodes, poisoning episodes, accidents he survives that he probably shouldn't. If you started counting the number of episodes where Homer is at some point on the brink of dying, you'd lose count pretty quickly. The show loves putting him there. Third, and this is the one the purgatory theory really leans on, the way Homer's life resets. The town resets after catastrophes. Relationships reset. Bart's damage resets. The children don't grow up. Marge doesn't age. Homer himself doesn't progress. If you describe the basic structure of Homer's existence from the outside, he is in a looped version of a life that refuses to move forward, where suffering happens and then unhappens, where his family experiences things that should permanently change them and then don't, where he himself approaches moments of insight or growth and then inevitably backslides. That structure, the theory says, isn't just television convention. It's purgatory, as traditionally understood, a place where things happen but don't accumulate, where the soul goes through the motions of life, learning, failing to learn, trying again, waiting for whatever the final judgment is going to be. I like this reading more than I can fully defend, and I want to be honest about why. It's not that I think the evidence is overwhelming. It's not. The evidence is about as strong as the evidence for the coma theory, which is to say, suggestive but not conclusive. The reason I like it is that it gives the overall shape of Homer's life a kind of weight that the coma theory doesn't quite manage. The coma theory has Homer unconscious in a hospital bed, dreaming, which is sad, but it's also a bit passive. The dream is just what his brain is doing. He's not in it on purpose. The purgatory theory has Homer being worked through something, waiting for something. Still, even in this strange, suspended afterlife, capable of the small choices that might eventually let him move on. When Marge tells him at the end of some episode or other that she loves him despite everything and he cries and they hold each other, that moment is not just a sitcom beat, it's a piece of spiritual progress. He's building up the deeds he'll need to get out. That's a more religious reading than I normally go in for, and I want to hedge against suggesting the show is actually endorsing a specific theology. It isn't. The show is a cartoon, and its relationship to religion has been, across its run, cheerfully irreverent. But the theory isn't really about religion. It's about a shape that the show's structure happens to have, whether the writers meant it or not. The strongest single piece of evidence for the purgatory theory, for my money, is the Ghost Dad segment of Treehouse of Horror 11 from season 12. Homer dies of broccoli, which Dr. Hibbert informs Marge is the deadliest plant on Earth. Why? It tries to warn you itself, he says, with its terrible taste. Homer arrives at heaven, and St. Peter tells him he hasn't done a good deed in his life and has to do one within 24 hours, or he'll go to hell. He tries, he fails, repeatedly. At the last moment, he saves a baby from a runaway pram, but St. Peter admits he wasn't looking and sends Homer to hell anyway, where Satan gives him noogies for eternity. Yes, it's a joke. Yes, it's a Treehouse of Horror segment. But the theology of it is consistent with Catholic purgatory. Homer is a good-hearted man who hasn't done enough specific good. His life is, from a ledger perspective, not quite enough to qualify him for paradise. He needs to do one more thing. He can't quite manage it. And so he has to keep trying over and over across infinite iterations of his own life until eventually he does enough or he doesn't, and one of the two outcomes becomes permanent. If you take that framework and apply it to the show as a whole, everything starts clicking into place. The loop time, the perpetual re-anchoring of the past, the way every Homer narrative arc almost ends and then doesn't, the way he almost grows and then reverts, the way he almost saves someone and then doesn't and then has to try again next week. The whole thing stops being television convention and starts looking like a theological account of a soul in suspension. I said a few sections ago that every theory we've walked through describes Homer as stuck in one way or another, and purgatory just gives the shape a name. And the name it gives it is, I think, the most merciful name. Because purgatory in the traditional sense is temporary. It ends. The soul eventually gets through. It's not eternal suffering. It's suffering with a destination. And if Homer is in purgatory, the show is, in a very roundabout way, promising that one day he'll get to rest. The show will end eventually, probably not in our lifetimes at the rate it's going, but it will end. And when it does, if you want to read it this way, Homer will have completed whatever it was he was working through. Until then, he's still trying, week after week, in small, clumsy, often destructive ways. He's still trying. I find that genuinely a bit comforting at 1 a.m. Anyway, that's the purgatory theory, the afterlife version of the coma theory, with more redemption on offer and less medical realism. Whether you buy it or not, it does a better job than most of the other theories of tying together the shape of Homer's whole existence into a single frame. But there's one more theory I want to walk through because it's the one that, in my view, hurts the most. It's not really a single theory, it's a pair of them stacked together, and they're both about the life Homer could have had if one or two things had gone differently. Specifically, if he'd had a different chromosome, or a different set of parents, or if the brother he didn't know he had stayed in his life long enough to change him. I want to start with Herb because Herb is the more interesting half of this and also the more painful one. Herbert Powell is Homer's half-brother. He was introduced in season 2 in an episode called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And he's one of those Simpsons characters who you forget exists until you remember him. At which point you realize how important he was to the show's understanding of Homer, and how sad his absence from the ongoing series actually is. The backstory goes like this. Before Abe Simpson met Mona, he had a brief fling with a carnival floozy. I'm using the show's exact language there. They had a son. Abe, being Abe, sent the boy to an orphanage in Shelbyville. The boy grew up there, got adopted by a couple named the Powells, and became Herbert, a self-made millionaire who ran a successful car company called Powell Motors. Herb, unlike Homer, got the ambition gene, the work ethic gene, the brains gene, and the confidence gene. He's basically Homer with, as the show has him describe himself, more hair and a little less gut. In the episode where they meet, Herb is genuinely overjoyed to find out he has family. He invites the entire Simpson clan to stay at his mansion in Detroit. He's warm, he's generous, he's interested in them as people. And he's convinced that what his car company needs to save it from being outcompeted by foreign manufacturers is a design from the average American. And who better to represent the average American than his newly discovered brother, Homer Simpson? Homer, given free rein to design a car, designs a car. A terrible car. A car with bubble domes and tail fins and shag carpeting and horns that play La Cucaracha. A car that costs $82,000 per unit. The unveiling is a catastrophe. Powell Motors goes under, Herb loses his fortune, his company, his mansion, everything. At the end of the episode, Herb boards a bus out of Detroit, and as Homer tries to apologize, Herb tells him flatly, "I have no brother." It's one of the most brutal lines the show ever wrote. There's a follow-up episode in season 3 where Herb, now homeless, eventually recovers thanks to an invention Homer unwittingly helps with. But after that, Herb basically vanishes from the show. He's mentioned occasionally, turns up in crowd shots, gets a nod here and there, but he's functionally gone. The show never gave him a proper arc beyond those 2 episodes, and he drifted off into the same narrative void that eventually absorbs most of the supporting cast. Here's the theory, such as it is. Herb is the life Homer didn't get. Same genetics, same biological father, same starting DNA, but different circumstances. Herb was sent to an orphanage, had a harder childhood, raised himself into something impressive. Homer stayed with Abe, had Abe's constant emotional battering, had Mona disappear on him, and ended up where he ended up. 2 versions of roughly the same man. 2 wildly different outcomes. And the thing the Herb episodes do that I don't think the show ever quite did again is show you Homer inside a life that wasn't his. For a brief stretch of those episodes, Homer is designing a car. He's being listened to. He has a brother who believes in him, not because of who he is, but before knowing who he is. He has access to resources, respect, possibility. He's not good at any of it, but he's trying. And there's a weird kind of happiness in him during those episodes, a happiness I don't see at the same intensity anywhere else in the show's run. It's the happiness of a man who briefly got to see what his life could have been before, through his own flailing, he lost it again. I find the Herb story sadder the older I get. Not because Herb is a tragic character, he's not, he mostly recovers. But because Homer, after the initial dinner, never gets back to that brief window of possibility. He returns to Springfield, to the plant, to Moe's, to the life that is actually his. And he does it without seeming to register what he's just walked away from. You can't tell if he understands at any point that this was his one chance. The show doesn't tell us, it just lets him go back, and it lets Herb vanish and the status quo resumes. Right, that's Herb. Now the other half of this. In season 9, there's an episode called Lisa the Simpson. Lisa, at the start of the episode, is experiencing some kind of cognitive decline. She can't solve a brain teaser, she can't play her saxophone as well as she used to. She panics. She goes to Abe Simpson, who confirms her worst fears. There is, he tells her, a genetic condition that runs in the Simpson family. All Simpson men start out smart, or at least normal, and then gradually become dumber as they get older. The condition affects the Y chromosome. It's called, in the episode, the Simpson gene. Homer, trying to reassure Lisa, lines up all his male relatives from across the country. They are, one by one, a parade of failures. Shrimp company proprietor, bird shooter at the airport, man who jumps in front of cars for insurance money, celebrity beggar, snitch, jug band manager, men who have failed at every conceivable vocation and several inconceivable ones. The Simpson gene is, on the evidence of the male relatives, real and thorough. Then Marge points out that Homer is only talking to the men. Homer reluctantly speaks to the women. They are, without exception, doctors, architects, lawyers, environmental activists. Dr. Simpson, in her white lab coat, explains that the gene is on the Y chromosome, which means women are spared. Lisa, who has 2 X chromosomes, is not doomed. She's going to be fine. It's a lovely episode, actually. Lisa's arc in it is warm and resolves in a way that genuinely uplifts. But the implication for Homer is a bit grim. He's canonically, on screen, confirmed to have a genetic condition that makes him progressively stupider. He didn't choose this. He didn't cause this. He's not responsible for it. It's just what being a male Simpson does to you. And the show has then, across the seasons that followed, continued to depict Homer getting incrementally dimmer as the years pass, which, given the floating timeline, isn't supposed to happen, but somehow does anyway. Combine these two ideas, Herb and the gene, and you get a particular reading of Homer that I find quietly devastating. Homer Simpson was born with a genetic predisposition toward failure, specifically toward losing his cognitive sharpness over time. He had no choice about that. What he did have a choice about, in some sense, was who raised him. If circumstances had put him in an orphanage, with different parents, with a different environment, he might have turned out like Herb. Capable, ambitious, successful. Not a genius because the gene was still there in the background, but a fully functional adult. Herb is the control group. Herb is what the gene looks like when the environment is supportive. Homer is what the gene looks like when the environment is Abe Simpson. Abe raised Homer with cruelty. Told him he was dead to him. Told him he'd amount to nothing. Lied to him about his mother. Pitted him against his brother when the brother eventually appeared. Continued into Homer's adult life to tell him he was a disappointment. The genetic predisposition toward cognitive decline was always going to be there. But the decline happened faster, and the resulting man was smaller because the environment was what it was. Herb got out. Homer didn't. That's basically the theory, stripped down to its bones. What I find interesting when I sit with this reading is that it lets you be a bit more forgiving of Homer than you might otherwise be. Not of the things he does necessarily, some of which are genuinely not okay, but of the shape he has, the man he is, the specific way his life has turned out. It stops looking like a referendum on him personally and starts looking like a combination of bad luck and bad circumstances that a different person with a better start might have handled better, but which Homer, being Homer, handled the only way he could. And the Herb episodes, by giving us a glimpse of the alternative, make that reading concrete. You can't watch Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and Brother, Can You Spare 2 Dimes, and come away thinking Homer was always going to be who he is. You can see the seam right there in Herb's face. That's the same DNA. That's the same biological father. The difference is everything else. I want to end this section on a small, quiet thing. Herb's last appearance in the show, really his last significant one, has him on a bus driving away. Homer tries to run after the bus, waving, trying to call out to him. Herb doesn't look back. The bus carries on, and Homer watches it go and then turns and walks back to the life he actually has. That image of Homer watching the thing he could have been drive away without him is, I think, the best possible summary of all the theories we've been through tonight. He watches it go. He doesn't follow. He goes back to Springfield. He goes back to the house. He goes back to the wife who loves him and the children he doesn't quite know how to raise and the job he can't properly do, and the friends who are not quite friends, and the beer in the fridge, and the life that is, for better and worse, his, which is as good a place as any to start wrapping this up. There's a thing I've been thinking about for the last couple of hours as I've been talking, and I want to mention it before we finish. None of the theories we've walked through tonight are actually the answer to who Homer Simpson is. I said that at the start, I know, but I think it's worth saying again at the end. Not because the theories are wrong exactly, but because they're not meant to be the answer. They're meant to be frames. Ways of looking at the character that let you hold him in a particular kind of light. You pick one up when you need it, you put it down when you don't. None of them explain him completely, because he's bigger than any one explanation, because he's been around for so long and been written by so many people that he's stopped being a character in the traditional sense and become something closer to a kind of folk figure. The closest we've got to a modern Homer, really, in the original mythic sense. Not as in he's a hero, but as in he's the sort of figure you can project onto indefinitely and still find more there. What I find genuinely strange when I sit with this is that Homer Simpson has been part of my life, and probably yours, in a way that most real people haven't been. I can picture his living room more accurately than I can picture some of the houses I grew up in. I know his couch, his armchair, his kitchen layout, the staircase that leads up to the bedrooms, the door to the basement, the view out of the kitchen window. I know where Marge keeps the macaroni pot with the pencils in it. I know where the spare beer is. I know the specific brown wood grain of the coffee table. None of it is real. None of it exists. And yet it's more familiar to me than places I've actually been. That's the quiet thing about loving a long-running show. The place becomes part of your internal architecture. You don't choose for it to. It just does. You grow up watching it, or you watch it late at night for enough years, and eventually the location becomes something like a childhood home for a childhood you didn't actually have. Springfield isn't where I'm from, but some corner of my brain behaves as though it is, and Homer, at the center of that, is the one I've thought about the most. More than Marge, more than Bart, certainly more than Lisa, though Lisa is probably the character I'd most want to be friends with in real life. Homer is the one who sticks, maybe because he's the easiest to see, maybe because he's the least defended, maybe because, in ways that are a bit embarrassing to admit, I see bits of him in myself. The laziness, the deferred intentions, the choosing of comfort over effort, the specific way in which a man can love his family without quite managing to be fully present for them. I recognize all of that. I suspect a lot of you do too. That's why the character has lasted, not because he's a brilliantly written hero, because he's a recognizable failure, and we are, most of us, recognizable failures too. I want to circle back to something I mentioned in the opening. The thing about how Homer first appeared on the Tracy Ullman Show in the late 80s as a scratchy little interstitial. Not a star, a filler, something the network used to pad out bits between the main program. It's strange to remember that now, because Homer has become one of the most recognizable fictional characters in the history of the medium. Maybe one of the most recognizable fictional characters in the world. You can go to basically any country and find someone who knows who he is. You can show a child who's never seen the show a picture of him, and they'll correctly identify him as a person who lives in a yellow world and eats donuts. He's shown up on Mount Rushmore in fan art. He's been drawn into the Sistine Chapel. He's a symbol of something, and the something isn't quite specified. The show has been around long enough that he's stopped being a character and started being a kind of reference point. Like the way Mickey Mouse isn't really a character anymore, he's a logo. Homer is part way there. Still a character just about, but also a shorthand for something bigger. American fatherhood, American working class life, the specific type of disappointment and warmth that defines a certain kind of mid-century masculinity that isn't really mid-century anymore, but whose vocabulary Homer still speaks. He's all of that. And he's also still just a bloke with a bald head who's had a long day and wants a beer. The theories, when I think about it, are almost all trying to reconcile those two things. The symbolism and the man, the cultural artifact and the person inside. Every theory we've been through is, in its own way, trying to work out how Homer can be both the empty cipher and the full human at the same time. And the answer probably is that he can't, and that's why the theories keep coming. The contradiction is the engine. As long as there's tension between Homer as icon and Homer as person, people will keep making up stories to explain it. Coma theories, radiation theories, purgatory theories. Everything we've walked through tonight, they're all versions of the same question, which is, what does it mean that this cartoon man has stuck with us for so long and felt so much like someone we know? I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does. But I think the theories collectively are a kind of love letter. Nobody writes this much speculation about a character they don't care about. The coma theory isn't cynical. It's not a way of saying the show is bad. It's a way of saying, this person matters to me enough that I want an explanation for why. Every fan theory is, underneath, a refusal to let the character just be a cartoon, a demand that he be more, that he means something, that the years we've spent with him have added up to something worth trying to understand. I think that's a generous impulse, even when the theories get dark. Even when they land on readings that aren't flattering. The underlying gesture is, I care enough about this man to want to know why he is the way he is, which is honestly more than most people get in their actual lives. Most people don't get anyone thinking about them that hard. Homer Simpson, a fictional man, has generations of people trying to work him out. That's not nothing, right? I've been rambling for a while now, and it's getting late wherever you are, I suspect. I've got a few other Simpsons videos in the works. One about Marge, which I think is going to be quieter than this one. One about Mr. Burns, which I suspect is going to be quite dark because Mr. Burns is always quite dark. One about the town itself, about Springfield, about why nobody can agree on where it is, which is a theory rabbit hole I'll happily fall into on another night. If you'd like to be around for any of those, the subscribe button does what subscribe buttons do, and I'm grateful to anyone who's listened this far. I'll stop here. I hope, whatever state you're in, whether you're falling asleep or you've already fallen asleep and you're going to wake up to the end of this wondering what you missed, that this has been the right kind of company for tonight. Homer is easy company, I think. He wouldn't have lasted this long if he wasn't. One last thought, and then I'm going. There's a moment in a treehouse of horror one don't fully remember now, but keeps coming back to me, where Homer has been sent through some kind of cosmic process and ends up briefly in a form of heaven that seems to be specifically tailored to him. And the thing that makes it heaven is not wealth or power or youth. It's that his family are there, and Mose is there, and the house on Evergreen Terrace is there, and there's beer in the fridge, and the television is on. Homer's idea of heaven is his actual life, slightly better lit. I find that genuinely sweet. It's not the answer to any of the theories we've talked about, but it's adjacent to all of them. Homer, whatever else is going on with him, whatever cage he's in, whatever version of his own story is true, wants to be exactly where he already is. He just wants it to be a little easier, a little more forgiving, a little less tiring. He doesn't want to escape, he wants to stay. He's always wanted to stay. That's the thing about him, I think. Whatever the theories say about why he can't get out, or can't wake up, or can't heal, Homer has never, in any episode I can think of, asked to get out. He's not trying to escape Springfield. He's not trying to get out of his marriage. He's not trying to find a way into a different life. When he dreams of this one, slightly nicer. When he almost dies, he comes back grateful. When he almost loses Marge, he fights like hell to keep her. When he almost loses his kids, he cries and apologizes. He's not a man trying to leave, he's a man trying to stay, and maybe that's the whole thing, really. Maybe that's the single true reading of Homer Simpson underneath all the theories. He's a man who loves his life more than his life maybe deserves to be loved. And the show has been, for nearly 40 years, a long, patient document of a man refusing to stop loving what he has, despite every reason the universe can throw at him to give up on it. I don't know. It's late, and I'm probably sentimentalizing, but I hope something in there has been worth listening to. There's a small thing I want to add because it's the last thing that came to mind as I was wrapping up, and it feels like the right note to end on. A lot of people, when they talk about The Simpsons, talk about the early seasons as the good ones and the later seasons as a slow fade. And there's truth to that, I think, as far as average episode quality goes. The classic era seasons 3 through 8 or so is genuinely the strongest stretch of episodes the show ever produced, and it'd be silly to pretend otherwise. But what I've noticed, the more I rewatch, is that the later seasons have their own quiet virtues. They're less sharp, they're less ambitious, they're often a bit sadder. And there's something about a show that's been on for this long, with the same family, the same house, the same town, that accumulates a kind of weight the early seasons can't have. The later episodes know things the early ones don't know. They know about time, they know about habit. They know about the way a life settles into its grooves and doesn't leave them. You don't need a great episode to feel that. You just need to have been watching long enough to notice. Homer at 39 for the 1,000th week in a row, doing the same thing, saying the same things, loving the same people, failing the same people, falling asleep on the same couch. That's not a joke. It's not even really entertainment in the classical sense. It's a vigil. The show is keeping a vigil for a man it's not going to let grow old. And if you've watched the show for long enough, you're keeping the vigil too, whether you meant to or not. I find that genuinely moving in a way I can't fully articulate. It's one of the reasons I keep watching, and one of the reasons I made a video this long about theories for a character who is technically just a cartoon. Anyway, sleep well if you're sleeping. Have a good rest of your evening if you're not. And if any of the theories stick in your head later, or you find yourself rewatching an episode differently because of something we talked about, that's the best outcome I could hope for. That's what I wanted to leave you with. Good night.